This is my sixth video in my Color and Light series, and it's about atmospheric perspective. Atmospheric perspective is the interaction of light with particles in the air. You have to have both because the particles scatter the blue light, which has the shortest wavelengths. So everything is covered with a blue veil. Look at this area in the distance compared to the area in front. There are few value contrasts. The saturation is dull here and bright here. There are no details or texture in the distance. The edges are soft. There's no yellow, orange, green, or red, and everything approaches a middle to light blue-gray. It shows depth. It separates the background from the foreground and makes horizontal surfaces like ground and water really look horizontal. And I'll show you a few other places where we can use atmospheric perspective. Let's compare this picture with atmospheric perspective to one without. In the distance, we see that it's a light blue with little detail, soft edges, little contrast, and no orange. And why do I care about orange? Because there's a blue veil over everything, and the complementary color to blue is orange. So we should only see orange in the foreground. In the second picture, there's some atmospheric perspective here, but not for the mountain. So it looks like this mountain pops forward, and we lose any sense of depth. Atmospheric perspective isn't just about the background, it's also about the foreground. So with this foreground, I made the colors much brighter and I added some complementary contrasts. And two things I think happen. First of all, this distance seems a little bit wider than this one. And also it looks like a sunnier day. You really need saturated colors to show a sunny day. So how does the color change with atmospheric perspective? Well, in the foreground, we have all colors, but you want to emphasize the yellow and orange. And that's because those are the first colors you lose when we go into the midground. And everything gets a little bluer. The red becomes red-violet, and the green becomes blue-green. And then when you get to the background, you lose the red and green, and all you really have are the dull blues and violets. And this makes perfect sense when you look at the color wheel. If we say this is the foreground, then you lose that, but you still have this, the green and red in the midground. And then in the background, you lose your green and red, and you have these colors. So it just follows the color wheel. Atmospheric perspective requires the interaction of light and air. In this first case, light only hits these cliffs due to a break in the clouds. So this area is not lit. As a result, it has the same values, contrast, etc. as the foreground. There's no atmospheric perspective here because no light is hitting it. For sunbeams, we see the atmospheric perspective as the sunbeam passes in front of a scene behind it. This picture illustrates what's called reverse atmospheric perspective, where everything gets more yellow and orange in the distance rather than blue and violet. And you can see the complementary colors in the foreground. I don't like this term because it's really part of the same process where elements on land acquire the color of the sky with distance. I took this picture and added atmospheric perspective. And there are three major changes. One is the mountains, which now look in the distance, definitely behind these trees. In addition, I imposed increasing atmospheric perspective for the water so it looks horizontal, and I added some orange in the foreground. And now the boat is the focus, whereas here there really isn't any focus. In my London picture, I imposed atmospheric perspective on these buildings in the distance, so they look like they're very far away. For the outside scene, I added some light blue gradually until I felt that it was pushed away enough. And for the car, I have atmospheric perspective here, but I softened the edges where the glass was to indicate that there is something between us and the distance. Here, I imposed atmospheric perspective on the people in the distance, so they look like they're far away from the ones in front. In this picture, the shadow gets lighter as it moves away from the bike, making this surface look flatter than the surface where there are no value changes. So any gradation from light to dark as we go into the distance makes a surface look flat. We know this background is vertical because there's no difference in the values in colors as we go up. If you did the same with the table, it too would look vertical. So here I made the orange darker and more saturated than it is in the background, and that gives us some sense that this is flat. I also added the characteristics of atmospheric perspective for these lemons in the water by adding enough light blue until I felt that it was pushed away enough. Although there's little appreciable difference in the air between the front and the back of this chair, I still imposed atmospheric perspective to suggest depth. So these cylinders are well formed, whereas these in the background are not. We see texture and detail here, but not here. Two other points. This area is the same distance from us, so it should have the same degree of texture and detail. This area has little detail or value contrast because it's being hit by the light. And when light hits an area, it interacts with particles and causes atmospheric perspective. Atmospheric perspective, then, is really about contrasts. We get decreasing contrast in value, saturation, texture, detail, and soft edges. And with the colors, the yellow and the orange would always be in the foreground because they're the lightest and most saturated. So an object that is yellow or orange will naturally look like it's in the foreground. Then in the midground, we have the greens and reds, which are still saturated but darker, so they would seem to lie between the foreground and the background. And then in the background, we have the blue violets. And so we're basically taking a trip from the longest wavelength light to the shortest wavelength light. So these characteristics help show depth and distance, even for small objects like the cloth on the chair. It makes surfaces look horizontal, like water in a tabletop. I also used it for a view through a window and lemons in a glass of water. The moon shows us what happens when a planet lacks atmosphere. This guy would only see the sun if he's looking at it. He doesn't see sunbeams. The sky is black. The values don't change much from the foreground to the background. The distant hills have sharp edges. The sunlight is white and shadows are either black or gray with no blue tints. My next video is about light intensity, and please subscribe so you know when the new videos are coming out.